Hello, here's the 2016 Ecology Study Guide answer key and guide for you. So the first thing is the levels of ecology from smallest to largest. So we're starting with the smallest studies of ecology, which is the organism level. That would mean one individual living thing. Then we've got population. Population represents a group of the same species of living thing, all living in the same area. So an example of an organism would be a clownfish, like Nemo. A population would be all the clownfish in that reef. Community is not just that species, but all the other living species that are close by. So that would include the stingrays, the anemones, the sharks, the turtles, etc., all of the living things. Ecosystem would include everything from the prior levels, but now we're adding in the abiotic or non-living factors, things such as water temperature, the amount of sunlight, the rock, the sand, etc. Biome is when you get a group of ecosystems that all have similar characteristics. We can group those together. So an example of a biome would be a marine biome, or a tropical rainforest biome, or a dry prairie biome. Biosphere, remember, is the entire layer of the earth, from the deepest trenches where we have freaky looking anglerfish to the highest upper atmosphere where those barred geese can fly over the Himalayan mountains. That entire layer from the lowest point to the highest point of the earth where we can find life is called the biosphere. Remember that that doesn't include the entire earth, because the entire earth includes like the core and the molten lava way down in the middle, and that does not have life, so that would not be included in the biosphere. Difference between autotrophs and heterotrophs. I broke apart the Latin roots there, so autotroph means self-feeder, heterotroph means different feeder. Autotrophs are things that can do photosynthesis, like plants and algae. Heterotrophs have to consume other organisms for food, and that's basically everything that isn't green on our planet. On the food web below, we're going to label all of these. All right, so on the food web, we're going to label all of these producers and things like that. So the producer is this green algae down here at the bottom, and then anything that eats that is considered a primary consumer. So these guys are primary consumers because they're immediately eating them. Nemo's dad is a primary consumer because he's immediately eating it. This little shrimp is eating it, so he's a primary consumer. And so is Dory. If she's directly eating algae, she's considered a primary consumer. But if they go through one more step, they could also be a secondary consumer. So if Dory ate the shrimp that ate the algae, then she would be a secondary consumer. So, for example, here we've got algae, little plankton that eat the algae, and then we've got a fish that eats the plankton, and then we can go up to a tertiary consumer, which is the shark that ate these guys, that ate these guys, that ate these guys. So if you can follow that, so every step goes from producer, primary, secondary, tertiary. Tertiary, remember, means third degree. Secondary means second degree. Primary means first degree. What happens to the energy as you move up a food web? So every step you go up a food web or through a food chain, you're losing energy. You can only capture about 10% of the energy that was available to the species before that. So that explains why we don't have a lot of these top-level consumers, because they rely on everybody else. And if there's not enough of this to feed this, then you can't have this level, if that makes any sense. Now I'm going to pause and we're going to go down and look at those energy levels and how those transfer. All right, so if we start with 20,000 units of energy, 10% of 20,000 is 2,000. So here this turtle can consume and have 2,000 units of energy. 10% of that is only 200 going to the shark. So for the shark, he gets 200 calories if he eats a turtle. If the energy went from the algae to the shrimp to Dory, we are going from 20,000 to 2,000 to 200 to 20 now. So he's going to not get a lot of energy from eating Dory because she went through a lot more steps. So energy has been decreased. Over here, if the algae gets eaten by a plankton, which gets eaten by a fish, and then up, once again, we're only getting 20 units of energy. So his best bet is to go after a primary consumer, like the turtle, instead of these secondary consumers here. He's going to get more energy by doing that. All right, let's talk water cycle. The water cycle has a bunch of processes that you guys are very familiar with, but some vocab that you might not know. Transpiration is where plants are losing water from the pores in their leaves. Percolation, think about like making coffee. The water is filtering through the layers of rock and it's going down into groundwater, into aquifers. Condensation is where we're going from water vapor to liquid water. That's what happens on the edge of a cool glass, condensation. Evaporation is where you have liquid water and it's being converted to water vapor or gas water, and that's what's happening when you have a puddle that dries up. Long-term storage, water is stored long-term either in ice caps, glaciers, or underground in aquifers. The nitrogen cycle is the one you guys should really focus a lot on. There is so many questions that you guys keep getting wrong. So nitrogen fixation is the first process. Either through lightning or through bacteria in the soil, we are going to capture the gaseous nitrogen, N2, that's up in the air, and we convert it to a form that plants can actually use and absorb. So once again, that can be accomplished through lightning, through bacteria in the soil, or if we make a really toxic chemical fertilizer. Nitrogen uptake and use is where plants are going to use all that nitrogen that's now in the soil, and they can use it to grow. Animals are going to eat the plants and produce waste, which contains nitrogen, that goes back into the soil, and it's cycling around in this very usable format. So that's the uptake phase. If there's excess nitrogen in the soil, more than what the plants are needing and more than the animals need, what's going to happen is that's going to be sent back up into the atmosphere, and that process is called denitrification, and bacteria are responsible for doing that. So once again, bacteria are very, very important to this cycle. They're responsible for bringing nitrogen down and sending it back up. Next up is the carbon cycle. Mostly what you need to know is the difference between sources and sinks. Sources are things that put carbon into the atmosphere. They're going up into the atmosphere. So this is when we burn fossil fuels or when we burn garbage or even have a campfire. Cows that are giving off methane gas and being all burpy and going through respiration. And then any kind of rotting material, rotting plants, stinky bogs, things like that. All of those are putting carbon into the atmosphere. And then sinks are going to take carbon out of the atmosphere and capture it. And so that would be photosynthesis, which captures carbon and puts it into a plant. We can also capture carbon and dissolve it into the ocean. Or we can capture carbon and form rocks, things like limestone, or long-term storage of carbon. So how have we affected that cycle? Well, first of all, we're burning a lot of fossil fuels. We're mining and removing those from long-term storage and sending them up into the atmosphere. We have increased drastically the number of animals and cows and humans on the planet, which is increasing the respiration and also sending a lot more methane up into the atmosphere. And then also we're removing a lot of plants by plowing things under and covering it up with houses and then removing forests. And all of those things are supposed to be removing carbon by doing photosynthesis, but we've killed them, so they can't do that any longer. And why do we care about carbon? Well, the big one is global climate change. And then also we have some strange growth in plants, trees that grow too fast and then fall down and rot, and poison ivy getting super toxic. And then we've got ocean acidification, which is killing off some of our coral reefs. For population growth, you guys should be able to recognize the difference between these two graphs. We have an exponential curve, which starts off very, very slow and then quickly spikes and seems like it's never going to fall down. This is something that would happen in a lab environment if you were raising bacteria in a petri dish, but eventually most populations are going to start to level off, and that's when it's called logistic growth. When it levels off, at that point, we call that point the carrying capacity, because that's the population size that the environment and the resources of that environment can continue to support indefinitely, forever. So if it goes above that, something in the environment is going to say, nope, and it's going to knock the population back down. So you might see it kind of wiggle back and forth up by that line, but it's eventually going to taper off, and that's our carrying capacity. Limits to population growth are here. We've got density-dependent limits, and dependent, whatever that is, it depends on how packed or crowded the population is. So as it gets even more crowded, all of these types of factors are going to kick in and drop the population numbers. These are tending to be things that are living, biotic factors. So things like diseases. If it gets more crowded, you're going to have more people die of diseases. If it gets more crowded, you're going to invite in more predators, and that's going to knock down the population. If it gets more crowded, we're going to run out of food, and that's going to knock down the population. So just think about density-dependent things. It matters if it's crowded. Density-independent. These are things that happen or exist no matter what the population size is. So it doesn't matter if you're in a city of 600 people or 6,000 people, the population is going to be dropped down. Examples of that would be any kind of natural disaster, a tornado, a flood, a hurricane, an earthquake. That would decimate a population no matter how many people were in that population previously. Or barriers like mountains and rivers. they're going to limit the population no matter how big they get. There's just a limit on where you can live. And then population dispersion or distribution. This is the most common way and also the one that has the greatest impact on the environment, and this is clumped. This is where populations are going to gather around resources. So here's Minnesota, so there's Minneapolis, and we are clumped or gathered around the river and the fact that that was a trade route. Up in Duluth, we're clumped around the resources of mining and also the lake. St. Cloud is clumped around granite quarries, which is a great source of income for people, and then also the farm community. Good farming up there. And then Rochester, we're clumped around the hospital system, right? So best habitat for us is in these cities economically. And we have a greater impact on the environment because our populations become so dense that our impact is focused on a very small area, and that affects the environment. If a population is spread out evenly, this doesn't happen naturally very often. It's usually artificial. For example, if you plant a farming field, they're all in perfectly neat rows, all evenly spaced out. That doesn't happen naturally. And it just says that everybody's going to have equal space no matter what the resources or habitat is like there. So you might get the unfortunate placement of up here in International Falls where it's freezing cold and it's hard to farm. Or you might get the really boring western bump where it's completely flat. Or you might get down here in the metropolis where it's kind of pretty and there's plenty of jobs and all that kind of stuff. It's just everybody spread evenly, and that's typically, like I said, artificial. For a randomly scattered population, there is no pattern, there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's not dependent on resources and it's not evenly spread. Instead, we see this with windblown seeds. So if you imagine if you just blew on a dandelion and all the little seeds run off into the wind, it's wherever the wind scatters them that they plant themselves. There's no rhyme or reason to it. Or if you had a milkweed pod that you broke open and all those seeds just flew all over the place, they're going to be randomly scattered, and there's no reason for why they land where they land. Here are symbiotic relationships. You can see their names and then the types here. So examples, if a fox eats a mouse, one organism eating another, the fox gets a benefit, the mouse suffers. So that's a positive, negative. Predation. Parasitism is where one benefits and the other suffers. And the only difference between these two is that in predation, somebody dies. In parasitism, they don't die, but they're going to suffer. So that would be tapeworms, wood ticks, mosquitoes, etc. Competition is where two different organisms are going to compete for the same limited resource. So if a chipmunk and a squirrel are both fighting over a peanut, that would be competition. If you have two squirrels fighting over a peanut and they're the same species, that's not considered competition because it has to be two different species. Commensalism is positive, neutral. Somebody benefits and the other doesn't even care, don't even notice, it doesn't affect them in any way. So example would be barnacles on a whale. The barnacles get a free ride to their food source, and the whale has no clue that the barnacle is even sitting there. Next up is mutualism. Both are going to benefit, positive, positive. Example there would be birds getting a free meal by cleaning all the pests off the rhinos, so they're eating the bugs, and then the rhinos don't have bugs crawling on their skin and making them itchy. Animal and plant species, we covered this extensively in class. You guys discussed them a lot, but we've got things like zebra mussels. Zebra mussels came in on ships and now they're spreading through rivers. They're really bad for our ecosystems because they are robbing other organisms of food and resources. Sea lampreys came in on ships through the Great Lakes and they are spreading, and they're not fun because they eat, on average, each sea lamprey can eat 40 pounds of fish in its lifetime, and they've hurt the trout populations and other native fish populations in the Great Lakes, plus they're scary. Asian and silver carp, once again, came through the Great Lakes. They were imported from Asia, and they're bad because they mess up the shorelines and the bottoms of our lakes, and they can also fly up and hit people in the face when they're boating, and that's not cool. Buckthorn is a kind of a brushy tree kind of plant, and it's taking over and outcompeting native organisms, so it's kind of conquering forest ecosystems. Poison hemlock is poisonous, and it grows like crazy. Milfoil is choking out ponds and lakes and rivers and making it so that other natural weeds can't grow there. Purple loosestrife is doing the same. It grows really well in wetland environments, and it's just outcompeting and therefore killing off native organisms. The formula IPAT means that the impact you have on the environment is a function of your population, the number of people, times how much stuff you use, your affluence, and then you factor in also technology, the good stuff technology can do. So if you increase the population